Hey guys, today is day 22. That means we're reading Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 22. So we just came off of yesterday's reading talking about the nature of faith, of how the beginning of Hebrews chapter 11 kind of explained to us faith. And now we get to see some examples of that faith. And really, we're looking at today, I titled my book, the faith of Abraham and Abraham's kids, his descendants, his offspring, his legacy. But what's interesting, kind of the bigger takeaway is, while if you remember yesterday talking about faith, one of the things I said that Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6 and 7 showed us was that faith is radical obedience. What today shows, I think, is that radical obedience requires radical beliefs. So if you're going to have faith, you've got to have belief. You've got to believe in something. And I hope I can show you that today in just these few verses we're leading. Notice when we look at verse 8, it starts out, it says, by faith. We're going to see this come up over and over and over again because the author is driving home that it is faith, salvation. These Old Testament saints, even Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, was saved not by his nationality, not by his race, but by faith. And so we'll see this keep coming up. By faith, Abraham obeyed. Radical obedience. We talked about that yesterday. He obeyed and he went out to a place where he received. He went out not knowing where he was going. But by faith, he went to live in a land of promise as a foreign land, living in the tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with the same promise. Okay, so we can see a radical obedience. This is pointing back to Genesis chapter 12, where God calls him and says, I want you to go from the land of Ur to go to this place. And he does. He goes. So he had a radical obedience, but the question comes in, why did he obey? Why did he obey this God that really he's never heard from? Why did he have radical obedience? And the answer is in the next verse, in verse 10, and that's because he had a radical belief. In verse 10, it says he was looking forward. Notice this, Abraham was looking forward. He was looking future to a city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Now, when it says that it has foundations, we think of our house, we think of buildings that have a foundation, but really what that word is, it means it's permanent. Something that has a good foundation is permanent. He is living in tents, and so he's looking to a future city, a place that has permanence, that is future, that is forever. Today we call this place heaven, and so he's looking towards heaven because what city goes forever that is designed and built by God? Heaven, right? Abraham, all the way back in Genesis 12, already had a belief, a radical belief in that there was a God, and that this God had a place set apart for those who loved him and wanted to be with him. And because he believed in that, when that God asked him to do something, then he could show his faith with radical obedience. But it goes on. Not only was it Abraham, but also his wife, Sarah. By faith, once again, by faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Sarah was really old, right? We're in the 80s, 90s when she had this child, and the reason that she had the power to conceive is because what? She had a radical belief. She considered God faithful, and because of that belief, she was able to express her obedience. And so she listened and she stayed, and God did what he was supposed to do. Notice in verse 13, it says, these all died in faith. Abraham, Sarah, they died. They died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. Abraham and Sarah had a faith in God. They had a radical belief in a God who is building a permanent city, but they knew they would never see it. They seen it afar. They could just see glimpses. They could only hope of what it was going to be, but that was enough for them. And so when it says that they greeted it from afar, they never got to see their faith come all the way into standing. They never got to see heaven while they were on earth, but they died knowing that they would get to see it again. Notice verse 14, the people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. They're looking for something more. They're going out further. Verse 16, but as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. They were looking for something greater than was on this earth. They had a radical belief which showed their radical obedience. Note verse 17, by faith, once again, right, by faith, Abraham was tested when he offered up Isaac, right? God tests us all. He tests us once again, and we talked about this a couple Sundays ago. He tests us not to see how great our faith is, but for us to see how great our faith is. And so notice God comes to Abraham and says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless your kids, and you're going to have all these generations come. And when he has his only child, Isaac, God tells him, you need to sacrifice. You need to kill the one person that will bring about the promises of God. I've promised you that everything's going to come from Isaac, but I want you to do it. And so what happened was, because Abraham had a radical belief, he could show his radical obedience, and he believed that God would do something. Notice in verse 19, he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead. He was about to kill, seconds away, sacrificing his only son, because he had a radical belief that God was good, God was holy, God would never do nothing wrong. And even if God allowed him to kill Isaac and sacrifice him for God's benefit, he believed in God that God would raise him from the dead. Now, for us that knows Jesus, that's a normal thing, but for Abraham, nobody has ever came back from the dead. Nobody. He's never even heard of it. And so, but he believed that God was bigger and more powerful. And because of his radical belief, he could express his radical obedience. And the question is, as you continue to read this, you'll see that this radical belief was passed on. It was passed on to his son Isaac, who then passed it on to his son Jacob, who then passed it on to his son Joseph, right? And so what is your radical belief? Do you believe God can do anything? And if you do, does that move you in a way that would push you and motivate you to radical obedience? Is God big enough, and will you follow that big God? That's what today's lesson's about. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope it's making sense, and we'll see you tomorrow. God bless.